So when we discuss drug control, most of the legality of drugs refers to a law called the Controlled Substances Act, which sort of discusses which drugs are going to have which classification and then what are the penalties, etc. So we have 5 schedules, and generally we want to think about, I don't want to get too caught up in the specifics of each schedule, but understanding that the schedule is determined and the penalties and legalities of it are determined by a couple of things. One, how potential is there, what kind of potential is there for abuse? The higher the potential for abuse, the more need to regulate it. What is the potential for physical and psychological dependence? Again, a similar feature to abuse of, in other words, what are the harm in taking this drug? So if we have a high risk of abuse and dependence, then that's going to regulate it at a higher level. And then that's offset by medical value. If it's harmful in terms of dependence, but there's a strong medical value, that sort of offsets some of that risk, and it would be considered a higher schedule, which means less restrictions. So we begin with Schedule 1, and the key features of Schedule 1 is that it's considered to be highly potential for abuse and have no currently accepted medical use. So things that are in Schedule 1 would be heroin, marijuana, and again, marijuana is a controversial one. Although there isn't a sense of abuse, there is no currently accepted, when it was first scheduled, there wasn't a currently accepted medical use. That's changing now, provides a lot of issues in law enforcement of how do you enforce a law that's been, a substance that's been declared partially legal, but is Schedule 1, which is one of the ones with the severest restrictions. Also, methaqualone or quaaludes and LSD are also classified as Schedule 1. Schedule 2 still have a pretty high potential for abuse, but now have some medical use. But the medical use has severe restrictions. So cocaine, PCP, amphetamine, and barbiturates can be considered medically valuable under very specific restricted guidelines, and therefore it's Schedule 2 because it's a little bit offset, although it's still high potential for abuse, it's a little bit offset by having some medical value. Schedule 3, we're seeing a little bit less abuse and a little bit more medical value. So a little less abuse risk and some kind of accepted medical use. A lot of the barbiturate prescriptions that aren't under Schedule 2 are under Schedule 3. So codeine and anabolic steroids have a lot of medical use. Steroids can reduce inflammation and can develop certain things. So, and codeine we know is a cough suppressant. So those have a good bit of medical value. And although there is still risk for abuse, it's sort of offset by this medical value. Schedule 4, we're moving even further. Not so risky on abuse potential, but have a strong current medical use. So here we're going to see a couple more barbiturates, phenobarbital, and then some tranquilizers like Valium and Librium and Darvon. So we're going to see that as our Schedule 4 class, and Schedule 5 class is pretty low abuse potential and has a great medical use. So non-narcotic medicinal ingredients. So an opiate drug mixture, but one that does not have narcotic effects might be Schedule 5. Also, we'll see things like over-the-counter medicines are Schedule 5. I don't want you to get worried about which drugs are in which schedule, but more what determines whether it's Schedule 1, 2, 3, or 4. So I want you to looking at the criteria more than the specific drugs that are in that schedule. So what happens with these different schedules? So Schedule 1, so we have two things. We talked about the dispensing limit. How can you get hold of it legally? And then penalties. If you do not possess, if you are found to be in possession of it and not legally, what are the penalties? So for Schedule 1, that's again, very high risk of abuse, no medical value, is only allowed for research. So you should not be able to get a hold of it. There's no prescription writing for Schedule 1. Penalties are pretty severe, 20 years, $1 million. Schedule 2, again, that was that high potential for abuse, but had limited restricted medical use would require a handwritten prescription with no refill. So these are the kinds of drugs where the doctor must write a physical handwritten prescription for every prescription that has to be picked up and hand delivered to the pharmacist to be able to fill it. So you can't call in a refill on a Schedule II drug. Again, being caught in possession of it without legal dispensing privileges is going to be pretty high time penalties, time in jail, and fines. Schedule 3 and 4, you can have prescriptions but limited numbers of refills to reduce that level of dependency. So up to 5 refills, but it has to have a prescription. Different amounts, again, 4 has a little bit less potential for abuse and a little bit more medical value, so the penalties are a little bit shorter in terms of years. Same fine, maximum fine. And Schedule 5 is generally over the counter, where it doesn't require a prescription, but abuse, large quantities of it can still have a fine and penalties. So another big feature of the Controlled Substances Act is this recognition that they can't put every single chemical drug on this list because things are being developed all the time. So 2 things that are covered by the Controlled Substances Act are analogs and precursors. An analog would be something that is designed to be very chemically similar to an existing drug on an existing schedule. So you're going to have the designer drugs where they alter a drug so it's no longer the same drug as the original illegal drug, but has similar effects. And what they find is if you have an analog, something that is chemically similar to an illegal drug, it has the same penalties as the drug that it is similar to. So we call those analogs. Generally, they're created in a lab and they're sort of made very similar. It's designed to develop a chemical structure that's very similar to another chemical that is a drug. And then precursors are examples of chemicals that can be used to make drugs, controlled substances. And they also have regulated manufacturing and distribution, and being caught in possession of enough precursors can be enough to trigger the same penalties as actually having the drugs that they make. So these are examples of ones where you have to be aware of, because even though they may not be a drug in and of themselves, they still carry penalties and risks with them.